I want to be precise about what the compact actually said, because precision is the only thing that explains what happened next. The Joint Stewardship Compact of the Varath Shelf, filed in the Territorial Registry of Concord Sector 941 years before Tharvanas ever set foot on the ice, was not a long document, 18 pages, counting the annexes. The first 12 pages were boundary definitions, which species held survey rights to which quadrants of the deep cold shelf, how extraction permits would be structured, what constituted interference with a co-signatory's established research presence. Standard language. The kind of thing that gets signed at the end of a diplomatic meeting when everyone is tired and wants to go home, and then sits in an archive for a century without anyone pulling it out again. You know the kind. Every territorial region with more than 2 claimants has one. The boundary definitions are always the meticulous part. Who gets which survey corridors, how far down the permitted depth goes, what the seasonal exclusion windows are for migration zones. People read the boundary definitions because the boundary definitions have immediate operational consequence. You need to know where you're allowed to drill. You need to know whose survey marker you're looking at before you start flagging it in your own data. The boundary definitions keep you out of arbitration for the obvious things. Pages 13 through 15 were the enforcement clauses. Clause 7 was the one that mattered. It read, in the original Concord transliteration, in the event of a biohazard class emergency occurring within the joint stewardship zone, any signatory party operating a registered emergency relay within the zone is authorized to trigger a mandatory assistance response. All co-signatory parties with patrol assets within standard response range are obligated to deploy. Deployment is not discretionary. The responding party does not require invitation. The relayed signal constitutes binding request. Clause 7 was 6 sentences. I have read longer paragraphs on ingredient labels. 6 sentences, and what they amounted to was this: if something biologically dangerous happened in the zone and you had a relay and you hit it, everyone who was close enough had to come. No negotiation. No acknowledgement request. No waiting for confirmation that assistance was wanted. The relay fires, the clause activates, the co-signatories move. The Varath Deep Research Outpost had been a registered emergency relay node since the day it was built. It had been registered as such because the compact required all permanent installations in the zone to carry active relay infrastructure, and the Concord's engineering team that built the outpost had followed the specification correctly. The quarantine relay was the third component in the installation's emergency stack, right below the atmospheric breach alarm and the structural failure beacon. It had its own power reserve. It had its own antenna array. It was, by design, the last thing that would stop working if the outpost itself started coming apart. It was wired to every co-signatory party's emergency channel. All 6 of them, including the one that had been added to the compact 93 years ago as part of a broader territorial recognition package that was mostly about transit rights and mineral survey permissions, and had, buried in its own annexes, a clause extending all existing stewardship compacts in the sector to include the new co-signatory. It was a housekeeping provision. Nobody had flagged it as significant at the time. Earth. Tharvanas had been the Outpost's senior research director for 4 years. She had read the compact when she took the posting, the way every incoming director read the founding documentation. She had read the boundary definitions carefully, because the boundary definitions mattered for her survey work, and she was meticulous about operational details. She had read the extraction clauses and the arbitration procedures, because the Outpost's previous director had flagged them as the source of an ongoing dispute about survey marker placement that OS would be inheriting. She was reasonably certain she had read pages 13 through 15 as well. She was not certain she had understood what they meant in operational terms. She had filed them in the part of her memory reserved for administrative background that would become relevant only in exceptional circumstances, and she had gone back to thinking about the deep cold sampling protocols for the season's primary research objective. She was absolutely certain, when she slapped her hand down on the quarantine relay at 3:17 station time on the 43rd day of the research season, that the signal would go to the Concord's nearest emergency response node in Sector 9. That was 11 hours out. She had calculated the 11 hours when she woke to the breach alarm going off in the lower modules, and her station's automated systems were reading biological contamination, and the seals were already failing. 11 hours was not enough time. It was what she had. She hit the relay because it was the only option she had left, and she started counting backward from 11 hours, and she began making a list of what could be done in 11 hours to keep 6 people alive in an installation whose lower section was being dismantled by something that lived in the ice below it. She did not know that the relay was going to go somewhere else first. I need to back up further than that. My name is Commander de Stewardship. I have been a flag officer in Earth's patrol service for 11 years. Before that, I spent 8 years as a line officer on smaller vessels in the same service, and before that I spent 4 years in the training pipeline that produced the kind of person who reads territorial compacts carefully and keeps the relevant clauses indexed in the working memory where operational material lives. I am not the most decorated officer in the service. I am not the most experienced. I am possibly the most thorough, which is a quality that does not generate ceremony, but generates a great many complete records and properly filed after-action reports, and those have their own kind of value. At 3:17 station time on that 43rd day, I was 3 hours into a rest cycle aboard ECV Measured Force, which was the senior vessel in a 3-ship patrol group running a scheduled sweep of the outer Varath transit corridor. We were not, technically, inside the stewardship zone. We were 41 minutes outside its registered boundary at standard patrol cruise, running the corridor sweep that put us in transit between waypoints 7 and 8 on the patrol plan, which had us moving roughly parallel to the zone's outer edge for a 6-hour stretch before the plan curved us away toward the inner sector survey positions. 41 minutes. The compact's language was within standard response range. The Concord legal office spent 6 weeks after the fact arguing about what that phrase meant, and their final opinion was carefully worded in a way that reached a conclusion without quite committing to a binding definition, because the legal office understood that a binding definition would have consequence for every other compact in the sector that used similar language. I am told the argument was vigorous, and that 2 of the senior counselors involved did not speak to each other for a month afterward. I was not part of it, because by the time the legal office got involved, I was back on patrol. My position was, and remains, simple. At the time of the relay alert, I was 41 minutes from the zone boundary at sustainable cruise speed, and the only document that mattered was the one that said I was obligated to deploy if I was within standard response range, and I judged that I was. The Concord legal office's subsequent opinion was that my judgment was defensible. I consider the matter settled. My comms officer, a petty officer first class named Imelda Varro, woke me at 3:24 by opening my cabin channel and saying, in the calm, specific voice she used when something required immediate attention but was not yet on fire, "Commander, Treaty Alert Compact 7, Varath Shelf, Biohazard Classification. I'm reading the co-signatory registry now." I was on my feet before she finished the sentence. I had been in the patrol service long enough to have Compact 7's clause structure in the working part of my memory, and I knew what biohazard classification meant for our response obligation. Whose relay? Registering to the Varath Deep Research Outpost, 6-person science station, Concord species, Vethani secondary branch, looks like, established 109 years ago. They've got a survey lock on the lower shelf quadrants, both of them. Response obligation. There was a brief pause while she ran the full clause check. I was already moving down the corridor toward the flag bridge, pulling on my duty jacket as I went. The ship's night lighting was still on, which meant the rest of the duty crew hadn't been stood up yet. This was Varro's call, waiting until she had the classification confirmed before disturbing anyone. Good judgment. Full proportionate response, she said. Compact 7 is mandatory deployment. Commander, it's biohazard class. The clause does not have a carve-out for station size, and it does not have a minimum personnel threshold. It didn't. I had looked at the Verath Compact 2 years earlier, when we first drew this patrol corridor, and I had done what I always do with a new corridor assignment, which is read every territorial document that touches it. I had noticed the mandatory deployment language, and I had noted the response radius question as an unresolved interpretive issue, and I had made a mental note that if the relay ever fired and we were in range, we were going. Things that have never fired before acquire a kind of ambient unreality. You know they exist. You plan for them professionally. You do not actually expect them to go off on a Tuesday at 3:17 when you are 3 hours into a rest cycle and nothing outside is anything except cold transit corridor. Wake Corsair and hold fast, I said, stepping onto the flag bridge. The duty officer, Ensign Priya Mehta, was already at her station. She had heard the alert through the bridge comms and had begun pulling the zone registry without waiting for instruction. I noted that. Signal Captain Ray's on Corsair that I am assuming tactical lead under compact authority. Get me a live read on the Outpost's telemetry if the relay burst included it. And Ray's Containment Group 7. I need the ECV Warden's reach repositioned to our heading. She's running 40 minutes behind us in the corridor sweep. Varro didn't ask why I was pulling a containment vessel for a 6-person research station. She knew why, because Varro had been on the measured force for 3 years, and she understood how I think about operational decisions. Biohazard class meant the threat was biological and active. The patrol cruisers carried standard biological containment kit, suits, sealing equipment, basic analysis gear. The Warden's reach carried the heavy arrays, the suppression systems, the full biological field lab that you needed if you were going to do anything with a large, unclassified organism that didn't involve simply killing it. You don't show up to a biohazard emergency with 3 cruisers and nothing to actually contain the biology, and then wonder what to do when the biology turns out to need containing rather than eliminating. Telemetry attached to the relay burst, she said, putting it on your board. I read it standing up because there wasn't time to sit. The picture it assembled was not complicated. It was, however, bad in the specific way that situations are bad when they have been developing steadily for a period of time before anyone called for help. Not a sudden catastrophe, a slow one. The Verath Deep Research Outpost was a standard 6-module installation bolted into the upper ice shelf of a deep cold zone, one of a dozen or so such zones in the Verath territorial region, characterized by extreme thermal stability at depth, minimal atmospheric activity at the surface, and the kind of sustained geological quiet that made them attractive for long-term research installations. The outpost had been chosen for its lower shelf access. The 2 lowest modules extended below the ice surface and into the shelf body itself, where the temperature differential between the shelf ice and the underlying geological layer created a research environment useful for the kind of deep cold biology and stratigraphy work the outpost was designed to do. The telemetry was showing structural compromise in both lower modules. The pressure readings were anomalous. The sealing systems were cycling in a pattern consistent with repeated external loading. Something was pressing against the lower module walls repeatedly from the outside. The thermal signatures embedded in the ice below and around the station's lower footprint were not geological. They were biological, large, moving. The outpost's own emergency log described the situation in the annotation field of the relay burst as organism contact, large, unclassified, nesting behavior indicators. 11 days of escalating pressure against lower module walls. Seal integrity declining. Contamination event triggered by biological material breach at low or secondary pressure skin. An organism in the ice shelf, nesting. The research station had, it appeared, been installed over what had subsequently become, or had always been, and was only now in an active phase of its cycle. A nesting site for something large and persistent that did not appreciate having a building in the way of whatever it was doing in the ice below. The organism had been pressing against the lower modules for 11 days. Not attacking, pressing. The distinction mattered. A pressuring organism behaves differently than a hunting one, and the response options are different, and the outcome possibilities are different. The telemetry didn't give me enough to be certain of the distinction, but the pressure cycle pattern, the way the contact force increased and decreased over a regular interval consistent with a sleep-wake rhythm, was not consistent with predatory behavior. It was consistent with something that was there before the station was there, and had not found any reason to stop being there simply because the station had arrived. 3 of the 6 personnel had been in the lower modules when the breach activity began. They had evacuated to the upper installation when the pressure anomalies became unmistakable. They were in the upper modules when the relay fired. Nobody was hurt. The crisis was structural, not medical. But the lower module seals had been declining for 6 hours at an accelerating rate, and if the organism continued its pressure activity, which everything in the telemetry suggested it would, because it had been doing it consistently for 11 days, the breach was estimated within 4 to 6 hours. 4 to 6 hours was inside the Concord response window. The Concord Sector 9 emergency node was 11 hours out. Tharvan Oss had done the same math I was doing, which was why she had hit the relay. ETA to the shelf zone boundary at best sustainable speed. Maida had been running the navigation plot. 43 minutes to the boundary, estimated 22 minutes from the boundary to the outpost position. 65 minutes total, Commander. Make the course change. Signal Corsair and Holdfast to follow at formation spacing. Tell the Warden's Reach to push to maximum sustainable and catch up on our heading. She'll arrive after us. I'm estimating 90 minutes behind. That's acceptable, but I want her there within 2 hours of our arrival. Lie. Varro put together a complete behavioral assessment from the organism telemetry. Everything the relay burst gives us. Size estimate, movement pattern, pressure cycle analysis, thermal signature. I need to understand what I'm dealing with before we arrive. I am not going to fly 3 cruisers into a nesting zone without a behavioral picture. She had it in 28 minutes, which was faster than the situation warranted her to be comfortable with, which meant she had pushed her analysis of the telemetry aggressively and had noted her confidence levels carefully on each assessment component. Varro always noted her confidence levels. It was one of the reasons I had kept her on the measured force through 2 crew rotations when I could have moved her up. I spent those 28 minutes with the compact, the outpost profile, and the geological survey history of the lower Verath shelf. The geological survey history was the part that mattered most. It had the thing I was looking for on the 3rd page, a minor notation in a Concord survey conducted 62 years ago, flagging the deep ice quadrant where the outpost's lower modules now sat as a zone of potential deep cold biological presence. Significance unknown. Recommend follow-up survey before installation activity in depth range 1540 meters. The notation had a flag status of secondary advisory, not mandatory, not a stop work, a recommendation. The lower modules had been installed 47 years ago, 15 years after that survey. I checked the installation documentation. The advisory notation appeared in the site assessment records. Someone had read it, evaluated it as a secondary advisory from an aging survey with uncharacterized biological presence. Not a known hazard, not a cataloged organism. A flag that something might be down there but nobody knew what, and made the judgment that it did not warrant changing the installation plan. That judgment had been defensible at the time. The survey was old. The notation was vague. The research value of the lower shelf position was high. Nobody had died from the decision for 47 years. The organism had simply been on its own schedule. Varro's assessment when it came was precise and appropriately hedged. Size estimate, large relative to the module dimensions it was contacting, bilateral symmetry indicated by pressure point distribution across multiple module walls simultaneously, appendage count uncertain but consistent with at least 4 contact points. Thermal signature, elevated relative to shelf ice, suggesting warm-blooded metabolism, unusual in documented deep-cold shelf species. Pressure cycle timing, consistent with a circadian or circadian-adjacent rhythm, with peak activity periods roughly every 18 to 20 hours and recovery periods in between. Behavioral indicators, directional and repetitive rather than random, concentrated on the module footprint rather than distributed across the surrounding shelf, which was consistent with site attachment behavior rather than territorial patrol. It was not hunting. It was not attacking. It was occupying a site and encountering an obstacle in that site and applying steady directional force to the obstacle, the same way water applies force to a rock. It was doing what large nesting organisms do when something is in the way of their nesting site. It was pushing. The obstacle was the outpost. I made a decision before we reached the zone boundary, and I want to describe it clearly because it came quickly, and I do not want to suggest it was difficult when it was not. The containment options available to 3 patrol cruisers and a specialist vessel included lethal elimination of the organism. Lethal elimination was a standard option in biohazard emergencies involving large, uncontrolled biology. It was often the fastest path to a secured situation. I set it aside. The organism was exhibiting displacement behavior, not predation. The personnel in the outpost were not being hunted. They were at risk from the structural failure that the organism's displacement pressure was causing, and a creature that is trying to move something out of its space is a fundamentally different problem than a creature that is trying to eat the people inside it. The former is a structural problem with a biological cause. You don't have to kill the biology to solve the structural problem. Additionally, we were in a joint stewardship zone. The compact's annexes were explicit about alteration of indigenous biological character in the zone requiring arbitration review. The organism, whatever it was indigenous to this shelf. Killing it without arbitration clearance would put every subsequent operation in the zone into a procedural dispute that would outlast my career. I had no arbitration clearance. I had a response obligation and 43 minutes to the boundary, and a behavioral picture that said I didn't need to kill anything to solve the problem. I told Reyes and Mwangi what I intended. Reyes acknowledged without discussion. Mwangi said, hazing array calibration for an organism of this estimated mass in a deep cold ice medium is going to be empirical, Commander. We don't have published tables for something this large in shelf ice acoustic conditions. The holdfast arrays are sized for standard large biology scenarios, not this. I know, I said. Run the calibration on approach and early on station. The warden's reach has the arrays that will do the actual work once she arrives. Use what we have to map the behavioral response and build toward the final configuration. Understood. We crossed the shelf boundary at 4:28. The outpost's external lighting was still on, all of it, which meant power was holding and the upper installation was intact. I hailed on the Concord emergency channel and waited. The response came in 40 seconds. A voice that was controlled and careful in the particular way of someone who has been holding a difficult situation together for a long time and understands that losing control of their voice is a form of losing control of the situation. Concord Standard, Vethani phrasing patterns underneath it. This is Research Director Os, Verath Deep Research Outpost. Who is this? Not a question. A statement of required information. She wanted identification, and she wanted it without the tonal content that would tell me how frightened she was, because she was a senior research director, and she did not make a habit of telling people she was frightened even when she was. Commander Desta Oren, Earth Patrol Corvette Group, responding under Compact 7 of the Joint Stewardship Agreement for the Varath Shelf. Director, I have 3 vessels inbound to your position and a containment unit approximately 90 minutes behind my position. What is your current status? The pause that followed had a texture I recognized. It was not a long pause. It was the pause of someone who has received information that does not fit the available categories and is doing the work of making a new category fast enough to continue functioning. You said Earth Patrol. Yes. Compact 7. Yes, the Joint Stewardship Compact for the Varath Shelf. Your quarantine relay auto-fired this morning at 3:17 station time. It transmitted to all registered co-signatory emergency channels. We were the closest responding unit. Another pause, shorter this time. She was processing faster. I activated the quarantine relay to signal the Concord Sector 9 emergency response node. This is conquered territorial space. You are in the Joint Stewardship Zone, I said. The relay transmits to all co-signatories by protocol. The compact has been in force for 141 years, Director. Earth became a co-signatory 93 years ago under the Sector 9 Territorial Recognition Package. The response obligation in Clause 7 is mandatory on all co-signatories with assets in standard response range. I did not choose to come. The compact required it, and I was in range. Silence again, longer this time. I let it go. She had 6 personnel and failing seals and something large in the ice beneath her, and she had just been told that her distress relay had gone to a party she hadn't known was in the circuit. She was entitled to several seconds of reorganization. We have 6 personnel, she said when she returned. 3 are in the upper command module, 2 are in the secondary HAB unit, 1 is in the communications alcove. No injuries at this time. The lower module primary seal is still holding, but is showing advanced fatigue indicators. The secondary pressure skin on the primary lower module failed 2 hours ago. Structural integrity assessment puts full breach of the primary lower module within 4 to 6 hours at current pressure rates. The organism is still in continuous contact with the lower module external walls. Understood. I had most of this from the telemetry, but I let her give it to me, because an assessment from the person on the ground is better than telemetry, and because she needed to go through the process of delivering it. It organized her. Can you get me an active visual feed from the lower module external sensors? I have the thermal data from the relay burst, but I want a current image. Sending. The feed came through on my main screen. I looked at it without speaking for a long moment. Maida, who was on duty, looked at it from her station. Neither of us said anything. The organism was visible in the ice below and adjacent to the lower installation, where the shelf body at that depth was translucent enough under the installation's external lights to show both thermal contrast and physical form. The shape it made in the ice was large, larger than the telemetry had fully conveyed, because the thermal signature compressed scale and the image did not. It had clear bilateral organization, with extended lateral structures that pressed against the module walls at multiple points simultaneously. Its surface, where the image resolved it through the ice medium, was darkly pigmented and textured in a way that suggested material adapted to deep cold pressure conditions. It was not frantic. It was not frenzied. Its movements were deliberate and measured, a rhythm of pressure and release that had probably been the same rhythm for 11 days. There was no malice in it. There was no awareness in it that the thing it was pressing against contained people who were trying very hard not to die. It was doing what it had always done in this site, and the building was in the way, and it was working steadily to move the building. Director, I said, I want your lower modules evacuated and cleared as completely as possible before we begin the hazing protocol. The hazing will take time, and there will be a period during which the organism's response behavior is unpredictable while it's adjusting to the stimulus. I do not want personnel in the lower installation during that period. What can be moved to the upper installation? The primary research archive, all current season data, backed up but primary physical storage is in the lower lab. The environmental sampling collection, 3 seasons of physical specimens. The lower lab's precision survey instruments. The collection is the most critical. The physical specimens cannot be regenerated from backup. How long to move all of it with your available personnel? A pause while she estimated. 2 hours, with all 3 upper module personnel assisting in rotation. Start now. We'll be on station in 12 minutes. I will keep you on this channel throughout. Any change in the lower module structural indicators, you tell me immediately. I paused. Director, you are going to be fine. The seals are going to hold long enough. Start moving the collection. She started. We arrived at the outpost at 4:40 and took up positions around the shelf perimeter in a triangular pattern chosen to give us overlapping coverage of the shelf below the station, without placing our hulls directly over the organism's estimated location. I did not want to put 3 cruiser hulls on top of a nesting organism that was already agitated by 11 days of encountering an obstacle. The triangular position gave us clear field for the array work and kept us from adding to the stimulus load before we were ready to apply it deliberately. Mwangi and the Holdfast's array crew began calibration passes at 4:57. The first pass was at a frequency below what the published tables predicted for a large organism in ice medium, because the published tables had been developed for water medium and open-air scenarios, and ice has different acoustic transmission properties. We needed to find the effective frequency range empirically, which meant starting low and walking up in increments while watching the pressure readings from the lower modules as a behavioral indicator. The organism registered the first pass as background. No response. We adjusted. The second pass, at a frequency 40% higher, produced a change in the pressure cycling, a brief irregularity in the rhythm, like someone being distracted from a task and then resuming it. The organism had noticed something. It hadn't stopped. We adjusted again. By 5:32, we had mapped the lower edge of the effective frequency range. The organism was registering the hazing as an irritant at that level. The pressure readings showed more frequent cycling, shorter peaks, the behavioral signature of something that was uncomfortable but not yet uncomfortable enough to move. We needed more power than the Holdfast arrays could provide at that frequency, which was what I had anticipated, which was why the Warden's reach was coming. While the Holdfast ran its calibration work, I had Rask, Specialist Tamber Rask, one of my crew with biological operations training, on the Outpost's internal communications channel to assist with the evacuation coordination. 6 people moving scientific equipment through a confined space benefits from a 7th person on the outside tracking what's been moved and where and what's left. Rask had done this kind of work twice before on different stations in different circumstances, and she was good at it. She kept Oss's team organized without taking over from them, which is the right way to do that work. At 5:19, the primary lower module's secondary structural layer failed. Not catastrophic. The primary hull was still intact, but the secondary layer had been the margin between structural failure and full breach, and with it gone, the hull itself was the only thing between the module interior and the ice environment. The hull was rated for this load under normal conditions. The organism's pressure was not normal conditions. The estimated time to hull breach revised downward. Director, structural failure on secondary layer of primary lower module, confirmed on my board. Anyone still in the lower installation needs to leave now. I have one person still in the lower lab with the sampling collection. Her voice was flat and controlled and moving fast. Tavrath, abandon the remaining collection. Get to the upper hatch now. I listened to the 4 minutes of comms traffic as the researcher named Tavrath secured what he had and moved through the lower module corridor to the upper hatch. 4 minutes of movement, of hatch mechanism cycling, of Os's voice tracking him on the internal channel, steady and directive without being loud. He came through. The hatch sealed. I marked the lower installation as evacuated and off-limits in the emergency record. Some of the sampling collection remained in the lower lab. 3 seasons of physical specimens, and some of them were still down there. Os did not say anything about this on the channel. She noted it in her own log, which I read later in the compact documentation. She noted it, and she moved on to the next thing. At 5:37, the warden's reach came over the shelf boundary, and her array officer, Lieutenant Cobb, raised me on the tactical channel. "Commander, I've reviewed the holdfast's calibration data en route. I want 20 minutes to configure the primary arrays for the frequency profile they've mapped. Request permission to take the lead array role." Granted, 20 minutes. The warden's reach was not the largest vessel in the response group, but she was the most specialized. Her primary hazing array had been designed for large biology in confined environments. The research had been done, the field tests had been logged, the parameters were understood. Cobb had used it on 3 prior deployments. He knew what it could do and what it couldn't, and he worked within those boundaries without having to be told where they were. At 5:59, the combined array pattern ran for the first time. All 4 vessels contributing, the warden's reach carrying the primary load, the 3 cruisers providing supplementary coverage from their positions at the perimeter. The organism's response was immediate and clear. The pressure readings from the lower modules dropped sharply, a drop of more than 30% in less than a minute, which was significant because the pressure had been building for 11 days, and 30% in a minute represented a genuine behavioral shift. Then the readings dropped again. The thermal signature in the ice below the station began moving. Moving laterally, deeper and to the side, away from the station's footprint, toward the open shelf body where there was no building in the way. It moved slowly. Of course it did. A large organism in ice is not fast. The process of displacement was not a single event but a continuous one, the thermal signature tracking away from the lower module's position in increments measured over minutes. Cobb tracked it carefully, adjusting the array focus to maintain coverage without escalating the stimulus beyond what was needed to sustain the displacement without causing harm. He was precise about this. The goal was discomfort sufficient to motivate movement, not pain sufficient to provoke a fight-or-flight response in something that large. There was a meaningful difference between those 2 outcomes, and staying in the correct range required continuous attention. I watched the pressure readings coming down on my board. Maida watched them alongside me. Neither of us spoke much. There was not a great deal to say while the numbers were moving in the right direction. At 6:41, the thermal signature had cleared the station's lower footprint entirely. 30 meters from the nearest module wall, continuing to move, on a southeast trajectory that took it deeper into the shelf body and away from the station. The pressure readings on the lower modules had returned to ambient. The primary lower module's hull, compromised on the secondary layer, was no longer under external load. Cobb maintained low-level array presence for another 40 minutes, tracking the organism's departure to confirm it was not returning. It was not returning. It was moving steadily, and it was moving away, and the behavioral indicators of the movement were consistent with a displaced animal, finding a new position rather than a frightened animal fleeing and preparing to rebound. I had RASC signal the outpost. "Director, the organism has cleared the station's lower footprint. Array coverage will remain active for the next hour to confirm no return behavior. Your lower module primary hull is compromised on the secondary layer, and the lower installation remains classified as off-limits pending structural assessment. But you are not going to lose the installation today. All personnel are accounted for and confirmed in the upper installation. Rask tells me the archive and most of the sampling collection have been successfully relocated to the upper hab. There was a longer silence on the channel than there had been for any of the operational exchanges, longer than the first pause when I identified myself. This silence had a different quality. The earlier silences had been processing pauses, the mind working fast. This one was the pause after the working fast had been resolved, when the body catches up to what the mind has been managing at a distance. "Commander Oren," she said. "Director." "The compact." A pause, "the one you referenced, the Joint Stewardship Compact." "Yes." "We are a Concord installation. Our affiliation has always been Concord Sector 9. Our founding documentation references the Concord Territorial Registry throughout. Your founding documentation also includes, as an attached land use annex, the Verath Shelf Stewardship Agreement, which is where the compact provisions live. The compact was incorporated into the original survey rights agreement for this shelf as a condition of multi-party access. It would have been attached to your station's establishment records at the time of installation. I paused, then said the thing that was true and needed saying. It is possible it was filed as a secondary document without prominent indexing. Compact annexes often are. The primary founding documents get the attention. We have 6 personnel. Her voice had changed slightly, not in discipline but in register. Something had unlocked in it. Not emotion exactly, precision. The precision of someone who is beginning to take an accurate inventory of a situation rather than just surviving it. We are a scientific research station. We are not a military installation. We are not a diplomatic post. We are not a strategic asset of any kind. We process deep cold biology and stratigraphy surveys. Yes, I said. And the compact's clause required you to respond to this station, regardless of what we are. The clause specifies biohazard class emergency in the joint stewardship zone. It does not discriminate by the type of installation or the number of personnel. It reads on the situation classification, not on the strategic value of the installation. A 6-person science station with a nesting organism breaching its lower modules is a biohazard class emergency. Clause 7 covered you. 3 cruisers, she said, quiet, careful, and a containment vessel. The compact specifies full proportionate response, I said. The threat classification was large, uncontrolled biology in a sealed research environment with active structural compromise. That scales to a containment-capable response. I brought what the situation warranted. Another pause. In it, I could hear her working through the shape of what had happened, and I did not interrupt it. We did not send the relay signal to Earth, she said. I know. We did not know the relay was connected to Earth's emergency channel. When I activated it, I was signaling the Concord Sector 9 node. That is who I was asking for help. Yes, I said, I know that too. We have been at this station for 4 years. This installation has been here for 109 years. In all of that time, in all of those research seasons, no one at this outpost, she stopped, resumed. No one knew. The relay had never fired before. Things that have never fired often aren't understood until they do. We should have known. This was not self-accusation. It was accurate. She was a person who believed in accurate accounting. Possibly, I said. The compact is in your founding documentation, but secondary annexes in century-old agreements don't always stay visible. What matters now is that you know, and the documentation is complete, and the compact is understood. I thought about the next thing carefully before I said it. Director, I am not here to make a point about due diligence. I am here because the clause required it, and because you needed what the clause required. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the organism. Still displacing. Southeast bearing, deeper shelf. Cobb estimates it will settle at a new site at least 40 meters from your station's footprint, possibly further. You drove it off. We displaced it. There is a difference. It is alive. It is moving away without injury as far as we can determine. It will settle somewhere in the shelf body that is not underneath your station. You could have killed it. Yes, I said. The compact response authority includes lethal options. I did not use them. Why not? It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer. Because the organism was not hunting. It was occupying a site it had prior claimed to, and it encountered an obstacle, and it was trying to move the obstacle. The compact stewardship language discourages permanent alteration of indigenous biological character without arbitration review. The organism is indigenous. Displacing it was sufficient to secure your station. Killing it was not necessary, and would have created a separate procedural problem that I did not want to create. A long pause. It was nesting, she said. Yes, what it had in there, we couldn't get imaging at that depth through the ice cover, but the behavioral pattern is consistent with nesting and site attachment. Whatever drew it to that location under your lower modules, it had been there long enough to make the site meaningful to it. We didn't know that. No, you didn't. The geological survey that was done 62 years ago, she stopped. There was a notation. I found it in the archive this morning after I hit the relay. After, not before. Secondary advisory. Potential biological presence at depth. I had not seen it before this morning. There it was. The thing that had been in the record for 62 years, waiting for someone to look at it with enough urgency to find it. It was there, I said. It was there, she agreed. We should have been looking at it. The installation team 47 years ago looked at it and judged it a secondary advisory from an aging survey. That judgment was defensible at the time. The science wasn't complete enough to make a stronger recommendation. The science wasn't complete, she said, because nobody had stayed to finish it. We were the ones who were supposed to finish it. That was the point of the lower module placement. Deep cold biology, long-term survey. And the organism we were supposed to be surveying was the one we built on top of. I didn't answer that because she wasn't asking me to. She was completing an accounting. 3 seasons, she said. 3 seasons of environmental survey data from the lower shelf quadrant. Atmospheric records, ice stratigraphy, deep cold thermal mapping. Yes. Some of it, much of it, may be data on the organism. We didn't know we were surveying in its territory range. We didn't know it was there. But the thermal signatures we recorded, the pressure anomalies we noticed but categorized as geological, the movement patterns in the deep ice that we recorded as statistical noise in the stratigraphy data. That's a significant characterization, I said. It is, she said. It is 3 seasons of inadvertent documentation of an uncatalogued species, in its nesting behavior, in its territory range, before and during the period of outpost disturbance. I understood what she was working toward. The joint publication provision, I said. The compact has one. In the survey rights annex, yes, it has not been heavily used. It exists. If we file through the Joint Stewardship Office, she said, the data sharing would be procedurally sound. The Concord would have standing, so would Earth. Yes. I do not know how to initiate that process. I have not read all the relevant provisions yet. A pause. I am reading them now. I have the compact in front of me, all 18 pages. I waited. We should have read it when we arrived, she said. Probably. The clause is clear. It is. Any biohazard class emergency within the zone, full proportionate response, mandatory deployment. The responding party does not require invitation. Yes. I did not know I was asking Earth, she said. I was asking the Concord. I hit the relay because the seals were failing and I had 3 people still in the lower installation, and the organism had been pressing for 11 days, and I was out of options, and 11 hours felt like not enough time. I hit it because it was the only thing left to do. I hit it for the Concord. I know, I said. And Earth came. You were in the zone, I said. The compact covered you. It has covered this station since before the current installation existed. You just didn't know it. She stood somewhere in the upper modules of her outpost, on the ice shelf of the Verath deep cold zone, with 3 seasons of field work in the HAB unit and a compromised lower installation, and an organism moving away through the ice below. And she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you." I said, "The compact required it." And she said, "I know, thank you anyway." We were on station for another 4 hours. The Holdfast structural team ran a complete assessment of the lower modules and filed a detailed report that would go to both the Concord Territorial Engineering Office and the Joint Stewardship Arbitration Board. The assessment recommended against reoccupying the lower modules pending full remediation and confirmed that the upper installation was sound. The Warden's Reaches Array crew maintained tracking coverage on the organism's displacement trajectory until it had settled into a new position, 61 meters from the outpost's lower footprint. 61 meters, on a bearing that would take any return-to-site movement across a natural ice fracture line that the Holdfast structural team identified and flagged in the remediation report as a useful buffer feature. The Warden's Reaches medical officer went aboard the outpost in a suit-over protocol because the lower module breach had left the installation's classification as a compromised environment technically in effect until the remediation was complete. She walked through all 6 personnel and signed off on their health status. None of them had injuries. 4 of them showed elevated stress markers consistent with extended crisis management without adequate sleep. She left a supply package, nutrition supplements, sleep aids calibrated for Vethani secondary branch physiology, some specific items for the 2 personnel who had been nearest the lower module work during the worst of the breach pressure cycle. At 9:22, Tharvin Os came to the external access point of the upper command module in a survival suit, and I descended from the measured force in a shuttle because the formal compact response documentation required a face-to-face confirmation exchange between the responding officer and the installation director. Protocol. The form required a physical signature, and a physical signature required physical presence. She was tall, as Vethani secondary branch individuals often are, with the characteristic secondary eye structure along the temple ridge, a feature I had seen in species profiles but rarely in person, this far out in the transit corridors. Her survival suit was old and well-maintained in the way of equipment you keep for years in a remote posting, because it fits you, and you know every adjustment point and every idiosyncrasy. She stood on the shelf ice with the outpost behind her, and the Holdfast and Corsair visible in the middle distance, and measured force large overhead. And she looked at the ships for a long moment before she looked at me. The ships were not threatening. They were not positioned in any way designed to suggest threat. They were running standard post-operation formation, arrays stowed, docking lights on, the functional, unremarkable profile of vessels that have completed a task and are holding station. But they were large, and there were 3 of them and the containment vessel behind them, and they had all come for 6 people on a research station. And standing in the shadow of that fact from the ground level was a different experience than processing it on a communications channel. "Commander Oren," she said. "Director Os." She took the form. She read it. All of it, not the summary review that most people do, but the actual reading, every field and every procedural notation and every cross-reference to the compact's clause provisions. It took longer than usual. I waited on the ice and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the form didn't already say, and she was the kind of person who would arrive at the important things herself if given the time. She signed it, handed it back. "The arbitration filing," she said, "for the nesting proximity exclusion zone. Your survey team initiates it through the stewardship office. Given the documentation from this morning, the structural record, the organism's behavioral log, Cobb's displacement tracking, The filing should be complete enough to support a recommendation for lower module relocation. The process is slow, but the case is clear. And the organism. 61 meters southeast and stable. Cobb confirms it's settled into what the behavioral indicators suggest is a secondary site. Not its primary site. The disruption disrupted it, but stable for now. The exclusion filing would give you a formalized buffer before any future lower installation work. She looked at the ice for a moment. It was there first, she said. Yes, I said, probably by several decades. We didn't know. No, but now the record reflects it, and the arbitration process will account for it. She nodded once and then said, the joint publication provision. I would like to understand the filing process. Send a request through the Joint Stewardship Office, copied to Earth's Territorial Research Archive. Reference this morning's compact response record number. The office will route it to the appropriate bodies on both sides. It's designed to be straightforward. The compact wanted co-signatory research cooperation to be easy, not complicated. 3 seasons of survey data, she said. Some of it may be the first field documentation of an uncatalogued deep cold nesting species. I did not set out to document it. I set out to do ice stratigraphy, but the data is what it is. That's how a great deal of the significant catalog entries got written, I said. She looked at me. The secondary eye structure along her temple ridge was still, which in Vethani's secondary branch biology indicates settled attention rather than distraction. Commander, why didn't you kill it? I had already answered this on the channel. She was asking again, on the ice, face to face. The answer needed to be the same answer, because it was the true answer, and the true answer doesn't change with the distance. Because it wasn't the threat, I said. The threat was the structural failure. The organism was the cause, but it wasn't the threat. And it had been there before your lower modules were there. Killing it would have resolved the immediate situation, and it would have eliminated something from the world that should not be eliminated from the world. And the compact stewardship language did not permit me to do that without arbitration clearance I did not have. So I didn't. I paused. And because we could move it without killing it, that always matters when it's true. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said the thing that I have carried since, the thing that sits in the specific part of my memory where accurate things live. I did not know Earth was listening, she said. I have been at this station for 4 years, and this station has been here for 109 years, and in all of that time, no one knew the relay was wired to Earth. No one knew the compact covered us. No one read the enforcement clauses closely enough to understand what they meant. A pause. And you were there. We were in range, I said. The clause required us to come. I know the clause now, she said. I have read it, all of it. She looked at the outpost behind her, at the upper modules solid and lit and holding, and at the ice shelf around them, quiet in the way the shelf was quiet when the organism was not in it. I read it after I hit the relay. After, not before, because I finally needed to know what it said. That's often how it happens with the secondary annexes, I said. It shouldn't be, she said. No, I said, it shouldn't. She looked at ECV measured force one more time, then she looked back at me. Thank you, Commander, for what the compact required, and for what it did not require. I filed the response record when I returned to measured force. Standard format, all fields complete. The form went to Earth's Patrol Command and to the Concord's Joint Stewardship Office simultaneously, as the compact required. Earth's Patrol Command sent 4 lines back 3 days later. Record acknowledged, documentation filed, resume scheduled patrol. The Concord's office sent a longer response, a formal acknowledgement, a request for the full array calibration documentation from Cobb's work, and a notation that the compact's response provisions were being reviewed for clarity of secondary annex indexing in all current zone installations. They were making the annexes harder to miss. Better late than 109 years. The joint publication request came through the Stewardship office 4 months later. Tharvin Ass's team filed it, with the full 3 seasons of survey data attached, and a preliminary analysis, identifying which records were likely inadvertent documentation of the nesting organism's territory activity. The Earth Territorial Research Archive matched them with 2 biologists who had been studying deep cold shelf nesting systematics for the previous 6 years, and had been missing exactly the kind of longitudinal data Ass's team had collected without knowing what they were collecting. The paper that came out of it 9 months after that was the first formal characterization of a species that nobody had documented before, in a nesting behavior that nobody had studied at this scale, in a thermal regime that the existing literature had not examined closely enough. They named the species for the shelf, standard practice. They named the genus for the compact, which I found out about from Varro, who had seen the preprint and sent me a note about it from her new posting. I was on patrol when the note arrived. I was on a different patrol when the paper published. I am, at the writing of this account, on another patrol still. The ice shelf of the Vareth deep cold zone is 238 hours from my current position at standard cruise speed. The outpost is still there. The organism is documented in the literature now, with a name and a behavior profile and a 47-year nesting cycle that explains everything about why the survey missed it and why the installation planners didn't know it was there. The lower modules have been relocated. The exclusion zone is in effect. Tharvin Ass is still the research director. She sent a formal notification through the Stewardship office when the relocation work was completed, addressed to the responding officers of the compact action, advising that the installation was fully operational and the documentation was complete. Standard notification. 1 paragraph. The last line said, "The compact provisions are now indexed prominently in the Outpost's onboarding documentation for all incoming personnel." All 18 pages. I think about her on the ice sometimes, in her old survival suit, looking up at the ships. I think about the quality of that looking, not afraid of them, not grateful in the way that collapses into itself, but doing the specific work of understanding what they meant, what it meant that they were there, what it meant that they had come for 6 people on a research station, because a relay had fired and a clause had read on the situation, and the distance was inside a phrase that nobody had ever had to interpret before. She hit the relay for the Concord. She did not know Earth was on the other end. She did not know she was in the zone. She did not know the compact covered her. She did not know we were 41 minutes outside the boundary and that 41 minutes counted. She knew none of it, and we came anyway, because the compact said we would, 141 years before she was born, in a document that nobody at the outpost had ever fully read until the morning it fired. The clause does not require you to know it exists. The clause requires you to be in the zone. That is all the clause requires. We were 3 cruisers and a containment vessel for 6 people on an ice shelf, and we drove the creature away without killing it because it had been there first, and the compact's stewardship language said the zone's biology mattered, and we filed the paperwork and resumed the patrol. The compact required what it required. We did what it required. That is the whole of it.